The wind howled outside as Amanda cradled her newborn son, Liam, in her arms. The small nursery was bathed in the soft glow of the night light, its pale light casting long shadows on the walls. She had just fed him, and now he lay peacefully in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling in the quiet room. His eyes were closed, and his face was the picture of innocence. Amanda felt a wave of warmth and love for her little boy, the kind of love that only a mother could understand. Everything was perfect until it wasn't. She stood in the nursery, her eyes wandering to the crib where Liam had been placed not an hour ago. His little onesie, decorated with tiny blue stars, was now empty. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. She blinked, trying to clear the strange sensation creeping up her spine. Was her mind playing tricks on her? The crib was supposed to be empty, but she could still feel the weight of the room shift. Something was off. She turned back to her son, still in her arms, and felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she looked down at his face. His eyes had opened, but they were not the same. They were cold, unusually cold for a baby's gaze, and his small, pale hand gripped her finger with an unexpected force. Amanda's blood ran cold as she stared into the dark void of his eyes, and the room seemed to grow colder still. Her baby, it wasn't right. Liam, she whispered, her voice trembling. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. The baby's eyes didn't blink. Instead, they stared up at her with a haunting, unnatural calmness. In the hallway outside, her husband, Mark, stood frozen in place. He had heard her whispering. He had heard the unease in her voice and the faint tremor in the air. Mark stepped inside the nursery, his brow furrowed in confusion. Amanda? What's going on? His eyes fell on the child in her arms. At first glance, everything appeared normal. But then, Mark too felt the strange, electric tension in the room. The atmosphere was thick, oppressive. He swallowed hard, trying to shake off the growing feeling of dread settling in his chest. Is something wrong? Mark asked softly, taking a step closer. Amanda hesitated, still staring down at Liam. There was something wrong, something she couldn't put into words. The baby's eyes, they weren't her son's. They weren't Liam's eyes. They were darker, almost black, and filled with an emptiness she couldn't comprehend. He looks different, Amanda murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Something's wrong, Mark. Something's terribly wrong. Mark's gaze narrowed, but he didn't speak for a moment. His heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to reassure her, to say that everything was fine, but he couldn't. He couldn't shake the cold fear creeping down his spine either. He gently reached out, touching the baby's cheek. Cold. Cold to the touch, just like the eyes. Maybe we're just tired, Mark suggested, trying to calm both himself and Amanda. Maybe we're imagining things, but Amanda wasn't so sure. She wasn't imagining the heavy air, the sense that the walls were closing in. The baby stirred in her arms, but it wasn't the familiar movement of a child. It was as if something else entirely was inside the baby, moving unnaturally. The baby shifted slightly, and for the briefest of moments, Amanda thought she saw something strange, something sharp, gleaming like a dark flash of metal in the baby's mouth. She blinked hard, and it was gone, replaced by the innocent look of a sleeping child. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. No, I'm just being paranoid. I need some rest, Amanda said, forcing a smile for Mark's sake. But it was strained, fake. She felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes were watching her, studying her. Mark seemed to buy into her words. He offered a faint smile. You're just exhausted, babe. We both are. Let's go to bed, and we'll talk more in the morning. Okay. Amanda nodded numbly. She didn't want to admit that something was terribly wrong. She couldn't even bring herself to acknowledge it out loud. With one final glance at Liam's still form in her arms, she slowly made her way to the bed, her legs weak beneath her. Mark followed, trying to push the unsettling thoughts out of his head. But as Amanda settled into bed, holding Liam close, the room felt colder still. A sharp chill seemed to seep into the walls. Mark turned off the light, the darkness enveloping them. The silence was almost suffocating. But then, from the corner of the room, a faint sound reached Amanda's ears. A faint whisper. A low, almost imperceptible murmur. At first, she thought it was the wind, the creaking of the house. But it wasn't. The murmur grew louder, more distinct. Her heart skipped a beat. It was a voice. A soft, sickly sweet voice, like a whisper in the wind. "Help me." The whisper was so soft that Amanda couldn't be sure if it was real, but it didn't sound like it came from the baby in her arms. It came from somewhere else, somewhere far, far away. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the baby in her arms shifted again, its body moving unnaturally, jerking in a way that no newborn should. Amanda recoiled, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in her throat. "Mark," she gasped, her voice barely audible, barely a whisper. But Mark was already asleep, completely unaware of the creeping terror that was overtaking his wife. And then, suddenly, the baby opened its eyes again. This time, there was no mistaking it. They weren't Liam's eyes. They were eyes full of malice. Dark, empty eyes that seemed to swallow the light around them. Before Amanda could even react, a low, guttural growl escaped from the baby's throat. A sound so alien, so inhuman, it sent a wave of pure terror crashing over her. In the darkness, the whisper came again, but this time it was louder, closer. "Help me." Amanda's breath caught in her throat as the room seemed to shift around her, and she finally realized what she had feared all along. The baby in her arms wasn't her son. It was something else, something far darker. Amanda's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening as she stared into the blackness of the room. The whisper that had haunted her ears grew louder, clearer. The cold, clammy sensation of dread clung to her like a heavy shroud. Her eyes darted around the room, but she couldn't see anything. The shadowy figure she glimpsed a moment ago was gone, swallowed up by the oppressive darkness. She turned slowly to look at Liam, the baby in her arms. He was still silent, unnervingly still. His face was twisted into an almost unnatural calmness. His lips stretched in a faint, sinister smile. Amanda's heart raced as she stared at his eyes, those cold, dark eyes that didn't belong to her son. Suddenly, the baby stirred, a low murmur escaping his throat. Amanda froze. There was something wrong with him. She could feel it in her bones. She could hear the soft growl that rumbled in his chest, as if some otherworldly force had taken control of him. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling, though she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. "Is that you?" The baby's lips moved in a slow, deliberate motion, as if trying to speak. His tiny mouth opened, but instead of a cry, a single word came out. "Help." Amanda's heart dropped, her mind racing with disbelief. She looked at Mark, who lay peacefully beside her, blissfully unaware of the terror that had begun to consume her. She wanted to scream, to shake him awake, but her voice was frozen, her limbs like lead. The room seemed to grow colder still, the air thick with a suffocating presence. She could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her chest, constricting her breath. Her body trembled, and her eyes refused to leave the baby in her arms. And then, a sudden thought flashed in her mind, a thought so chilling that it made her stomach twist. What if this wasn't Liam? What if it wasn't her son at all? What if something far darker had taken his place? Her gaze shifted to the door, where the shadowy figure had been moments before. She had only seen it for a split second, but it had been enough to stir something deep within her. An instinct that screamed at her to run, to escape. But escape from what and where? A soft rustling sound broke her train of thought. Her eyes darted to the crib, where the faint outline of another figure seemed to be watching her. It was so faint it almost seemed like a trick of the light. But Amanda knew what she had seen. She wasn't imagining things. There was something in the room with them. Before she could react, the air grew thick again, and the soft whisper returned. It wasn't coming from the baby anymore. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere just beyond her reach. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. "Help me." Amanda's skin prickled with terror. She wanted to run, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The room was closing in around her, suffocating her. She could hear Mark's steady breathing beside her, completely unaware of the horror that was unfolding right in front of him. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, like a door creaking open, but no door had moved. Her gaze snapped to the window and she gasped. The curtains, which had been still just moments ago, were now swaying in the wind, despite the fact that there was no breeze. The moonlight outside seemed to flicker, casting eerie shadows across the room. Amanda could feel her sanity slipping. The atmosphere had changed, thickened, darkened. The baby in her arms had stopped moving, and an unsettling silence enveloped the room. But just as Amanda thought she might lose herself entirely, she heard it. The sound of a soft, gentle tapping. It was so faint at first that she wasn't sure if she was imagining it. But then it grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from the wall, the farthest wall, the one closest to the door. Amanda's heartbeat echoed in her ears as she tried to focus on the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was like someone was knocking from the inside of the wall. It was as if the house itself was alive, its very bones groaning under the weight of some terrible secret. "Mark," Amanda whispered again, shaking him lightly, but her husband didn't stir. She grabbed his shoulder, shaking him more forcefully. Still nothing. The tapping continued, rhythmic and relentless. Each tap felt like a pulse, like the heartbeat of something ancient, something dark and alive. The baby's eyes locked onto hers again, and in them, she saw the reflection of a nightmare that had no end. In a blind panic, Amanda stood up, clutching Liam in her arms. The baby's grip on her tightened, but she didn't care. She had to get out of that room. She had to escape. The sound of the tapping grew louder, closer. The walls seemed to bend and shift with each tap, distorting the room. And then, just as she was about to run for the door, the whispers came again. Louder now, almost deafening. "Help me!" Amanda froze in place, her mind racing. Where was the voice coming from? It wasn't coming from the baby anymore. It was coming from somewhere deeper, deeper within the house. A sound so hollow, so full of despair, it could only belong to someone who had been trapped for far too long. The floor beneath her feet groaned as if it, too, was alive. The walls seemed to close in on her, the space becoming smaller, suffocating. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the door swung open with a deafening bang. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and dark, almost skeletal in appearance. A shadowy figure cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. But Amanda knew who it was. She could feel it. It was the figure she had seen earlier, the one in the shadows. But now it was clear. It was real. "Help me," the figure rasped, its voice cold and hollow. "I need to be set free." Amanda's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to the floor, her grip on the baby tightening in fear. Liam's eyes never left hers, and his grip on her finger remained, unyielding. Amanda's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening as she stared into the blackness of the room. The whisper that had haunted her ears grew louder, clearer. The cold, clammy sensation of dread clung to her like a heavy shroud. Her eyes darted around the room, but she couldn't see anything. The shadowy figure she'd glimpsed a moment ago was gone, swallowed up by the oppressive darkness. She turned slowly to look at Liam, the baby in her arms. He was still silent, unnervingly still. His face was twisted into an almost unnatural calmness. His lips stretched in a faint, sinister smile. Amanda's heart raced as she stared at his eyes. Those cold, dark eyes that didn't belong to her son. Suddenly, the baby stirred, a low murmur escaping his throat. Amanda froze. There was something wrong with him. She could feel it in her bones. She could hear the soft growl that rumbled in his chest, as if some otherworldly force had taken control of him. "Liam," she whispered, her voice trembling, though she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear the answer. "Is that you?" The baby's lips moved in a slow, deliberate motion, as if trying to speak. His tiny mouth opened, but instead of a cry, a single word came out. "Help!" Amanda's heart dropped, her mind racing with disbelief. She looked at Mark, who lay peacefully beside her, blissfully unaware of the terror that had begun to consume her. She wanted to scream, to shake him awake, but her voice was frozen, her limbs like lead. The room seemed to grow colder still, the air thick with a suffocating presence. She could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her chest, constricting her breath. Her body trembled, and her eyes refused to leave the baby in her arms. And then, a sudden thought flashed in her mind, a thought so chilling that it made her stomach twist. What if this wasn't Liam? What if it wasn't her son at all? What if something far darker had taken his place? Her gaze shifted to the door, where the shadowy figure had been moments before. She had only seen it for a split second, but it had been enough to stir something deep within her. An instinct that screamed at her to run, to escape. But escape from what and where? A soft rustling sound broke her train of thought. Her eyes darted to the crib, where the faint outline of another figure seemed to be watching her. It was so faint it almost seemed like a trick of the light. But Amanda knew what she had seen. She wasn't imagining things. There was something in the room with them. Before she could react, the air grew thick again, and the soft whisper returned. It wasn't coming from the baby anymore. It was coming from somewhere else, somewhere just beyond her reach. The voice was faint, but it was unmistakable. "Help me!" Amanda's skin prickled with terror. She wanted to run, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The room was closing in around her, suffocating her. She could hear Mark's steady breathing beside her, completely unaware of the horror that was unfolding right in front of him. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise, like a door creaking open, but no door had moved. Her gaze snapped to the window and she gasped. The curtains, which had been still just moments ago, were now swaying in the wind, despite the fact that there was no breeze. The moonlight outside seemed to flicker, casting eerie shadows across the room. Amanda could feel her sanity slipping. The atmosphere had changed, thickened, darkened. The baby in her arms had stopped moving, and an unsettling silence enveloped the room. But just as Amanda thought she might lose herself entirely, she heard it. The sound of a soft, gentle tapping. It was so faint at first that she wasn't sure if she was imagining it. But then it grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was coming from the wall, the farthest wall, the one closest to the door. Amanda's heartbeat echoed in her ears, as she tried to focus on the sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was like someone was knocking from the inside of the wall. It was as if the house itself was alive, its very bones groaning under the weight of some terrible secret. "Mark," Amanda whispered again, shaking him lightly, but her husband didn't stir. She grabbed his shoulder, shaking him more forcefully. Still nothing. The tapping continued, rhythmic and relentless. Each tap felt like a pulse, like the heartbeat of something ancient, something dark and alive. The baby's eyes locked onto hers again, and in them, she saw the reflection of a nightmare that had no end. In a blind panic, Amanda stood up, clutching Liam in her arms. The baby's grip on her tightened, but she didn't care. She had to get out of that room. She had to escape. The sound of the tapping grew louder, closer. The walls seemed to bend and shift with each tap, distorting the room. And then, just as she was about to run for the door, the whispers came again. Louder now, almost deafening. "Help me!" Amanda froze in place, her mind racing. Where was the voice coming from? It wasn't coming from the baby anymore. It was coming from somewhere deeper, deeper within the house. A sound so hollow, so full of despair, it could only belong to someone who had been trapped for far too long. The floor beneath her feet groaned as if it, too, was alive. The walls seemed to close in on her, the space becoming smaller, suffocating. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the door swung open with a deafening bang. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and dark, almost skeletal in appearance. A shadowy figure cloaked in darkness, its face obscured. But Amanda knew who it was. She could feel it. It was the figure she had seen earlier, the one in the shadows. But now it was clear. It was real. "Help me," the figure rasped, its voice cold and hollow. "I need to be set free." Amanda's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to the floor, her grip on the baby tightening in fear. Liam's eyes never left hers, and his grip on her finger remained, unyielding. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as the lights flickered once again, plunging the room into complete darkness. Her heart raced, the pounding in her chest deafening in the silence. She could feel her hands trembling as she clutched Liam tighter to her chest, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. The shadowy figure standing in the doorway had vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving nothing but the oppressive weight of dread hanging in the air. She tried to call out to Mark, her voice barely a whisper, but the words wouldn't come. It was as if the very air in the room had thickened, swallowing her voice before it could escape. The only sound that filled the room was the soft, rhythmic thumping of her heartbeat, which seemed to echo in the darkness. The baby Liam remained eerily still in her arms, his cold little body an unsettling contrast to the warmth she so desperately craved. His eyes, those dark, empty eyes, never left her face, and she could feel the weight of his gaze, as though he were watching her, studying her. But it wasn't just Liam anymore. The room was filled with something else, something alive, something sinister. Amanda's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Was it really possible? Could this child, this baby in her arms, be the same one she had given birth to? Or was it someone else entirely? The darkness seemed to pulse, a living entity that surrounded her, closing in tighter with each passing second. The walls felt as though they were pressing in, the air thick and suffocating. The temperature had dropped significantly, and Amanda could see her breath misting in front of her face, despite the fact that the house had always been warm. A shiver ran down her spine, and she tightened her grip on Liam, unwilling to let go. But in the back of her mind, a nagging voice whispered that it might already be too late. Suddenly, A sound cut through the silence, a soft, shuffling noise. It was coming from the corner of the room, the farthest corner, the one where she had seen the shadowy figure just moments before. Amanda's eyes snapped to the corner, straining to see anything in the impenetrable darkness. A low, rasping breath echoed in the room, followed by a guttural, almost inhuman growl. The sound was so close, so unnervingly near, that Amanda's blood ran cold. Her pulse quickened as her gaze darted around the room, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing. Nothing but the oppressive silence and the sense that something was watching her, waiting. Her breath hitched as she looked down at Liam, his eyes still locked on hers. He had stopped making any noise, but there was an intensity in his stare that made Amanda's skin crawl. His small fingers curled around her shirt, his grip tight and unyielding. And then, as if to confirm her worst fear, he smiled. A wide, toothless grin that sent a jolt of terror straight through her. Amanda's mind reeled, but before she could make sense of what was happening, the temperature in the room dropped even further. She could see her breath, clouding in front of her like smoke. The soft, shuffling sound grew louder, closer, until it felt like it was right behind her. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she slowly turned her head, dreading what she would find. And then, there it was, a figure faint and translucent, standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin, its features blurred and distorted, but Amanda could make out a pair of glowing eyes. Eyes that were fixed on her. Eyes that seemed to bore straight through her soul. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and Amanda's blood ran cold. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. All she could do was stare at the apparition that seemed to be moving toward her. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the figure spoke. "Help me." Amanda's throat tightened, but the words wouldn't come. Her body refused to obey her, and she found herself frozen in place, trapped in the unrelenting grip of fear. The figure's presence was overwhelming, suffocating, and Amanda could feel its coldness seeping into her very bones. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in on her as if the house itself were closing in around her. "Help me." The voice grew louder, more insistent, and Amanda could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. The words echoed in her mind, reverberating like a hollow cry for mercy. But there was no mercy here, no escape. The figure took another step forward, and then another until it was standing directly in front of her. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as the temperature continued to plummet. The chill was unbearable, the cold seeping deep into her skin. She could see the figure's face now, twisted and distorted, its eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity. "Please," Amanda's voice was barely a whisper, her body trembling as she fought to regain control. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out toward her, its long skeletal fingers stretching out to touch her. Amanda flinched, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare that had no end. The baby in her arms shifted, his small body moving as though responding to the figure's presence. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished, gone, as though it had never been there at all. Amanda's breath came in ragged gasps, and she blinked rapidly, trying to shake the image from her mind. She looked down at Liam, her heart racing, but the baby was still, his cold, lifeless eyes staring up at her, unblinking. But something was different. There was something wrong with the baby's smile. It wasn't just the smile of a child. It was something darker, a smile that didn't belong to a baby at all. Amanda stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her. She fell to the floor, the baby still in her arms, his tiny hands gripping her tightly. The room was spinning, the walls closing in. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. And then, as the darkness swallowed her whole, she heard it. The whispering voice again. This time it was louder, clearer, more insistent. "Help me!" Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as the room seemed to twist and contort around her. She could feel herself being pulled into the darkness, deeper and deeper, until there was nothing but the voice and the eyes. The eyes that watched her, unblinking, unyielding, and she knew deep down that it was too late. The darkness lingered, a heavy weight pressing down on Amanda's chest, suffocating her as she struggled to take a breath. Her limbs felt heavy, as if they were bound by invisible ropes, and her mind was clouded, fogged with confusion. Where was she? What had happened? Her thoughts were fragmented, broken into pieces that she couldn't quite put together. She tried to move, but it felt as though she were trapped in place, unable to free herself from the suffocating grip of the shadows. Her body was numb, her senses dulled, and yet, in the deepest corners of her mind, a single thought echoed relentlessly: the baby. Amanda's eyes fluttered open, the light around her a harsh, sterile white that stung her vision. She squinted, trying to focus, but everything was blurry, out of place. The edges of her world felt distorted, as though reality itself was unraveling before her. "Mark," she croaked, her voice hoarse and weak, but no sound escaped her lips. Her heart pounded in her chest as panic began to rise. Where was Mark? Why was she alone? She blinked again, trying to make sense of the dimly lit room. It was small, cold, and unfamiliar. The air smelled sterile, like a hospital, but there was something else, something darker lurking beneath the surface. A sharp metallic scent lingered in the air, making her stomach turn. "Liam," she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Her eyes darted to the crib beside her, and there, nestled among soft blankets, was the baby. Liam. He was motionless, his small form lying unnaturally still, his chest rising and falling with each slow, shallow breath. But his face was different. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. The baby's eyes, dark and empty, were wide open, staring up at the ceiling with an unblinking gaze that made her blood run cold. And his smile, it was wrong. It wasn't the innocent smile of a baby. No, it was something twisted, something that sent chills crawling up her spine. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder, cold and clammy. She flinched and turned, but no one was there. "Snap out of it," she told herself. "This is just a dream. You're just tired." But when she looked back at the baby, her heart skipped a beat. His eyes were no longer staring up at the ceiling. They were fixed on her, and his smile, it had widened impossibly wide, stretching across his face like a grotesque mask. She gasped, her mind screaming for her to run, but her body remained frozen, as if trapped in a nightmare that she couldn't escape. Her fingers trembled as she reached out toward the crib, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Liam," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What's wrong with you?" The baby didn't respond. He simply lay there, staring at her, his gaze never leaving her face. And then, to Amanda's horror, he began to crawl. But it wasn't a crawl that a baby should do. His limbs moved unnaturally fast, jerking in a way that made her stomach twist with nausea. He moved toward her with alarming speed, his tiny hands grasping the edge of the crib, his mouth curling into that horrible smile as he drew closer and closer. Amanda stumbled back, her heart racing. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." But as the baby drew nearer, her fear intensified. His smile was no longer sweet or innocent. It was something darker, something she couldn't quite comprehend. It was as if the baby had become a vessel for something else. Suddenly, she heard a sound, a voice, whispering from the darkness. "Help me!" Amanda's blood ran cold. The voice, it wasn't the baby's. It was low, guttural, full of pain and desperation. The sound came from behind her, and before she could turn, she felt the cold, clammy touch on her back again. The air was thick with the same metallic scent she'd noticed earlier, and the temperature had plummeted. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, just out of reach. Her breath hitched as she realized that the room was no longer the sterile, white place she had first seen. The walls seemed to bend and warp, twisting in unnatural angles. The lights flickered, casting eerie, elongated shadows that danced across the walls like mocking figures. The baby was still crawling toward her, but now, the sound of its movements was accompanied by something else. Whispers, faint at first but growing louder with each passing second. The whispers grew more frantic, more urgent, until they filled the room, echoing in her ears like 1,000 voices all crying out at once. "Help me," the voice whispered again. "Please." Amanda's heart thudded in her chest. The whispers weren't just in her mind. They were coming from the baby. The same dark, empty eyes were fixed on her, and the words spilled from the baby's mouth, each syllable dripping with malice and sorrow. The baby's body jerked forward, its movements unnatural, its skin stretching in ways it shouldn't have. The smile widened even further, impossibly large, as if it were about to swallow her whole. The whispers turned into a roar, filling her head, drowning out everything else. And then the room grew still. The whispering stopped, and the baby ceased its unnatural crawling. Amanda could barely breathe. She didn't know what was real anymore. Was this her child? Was this Liam? Her hands trembled as she reached for him, her fingers brushing his cold skin. And then, to her horror, she saw something that made her blood run ice cold. Something that she couldn't explain. The baby's skin, beneath her touch, shifted. She recoiled, her heart racing. The skin beneath her fingers was no longer soft and smooth. Felt like fabric. It was as though the skin was a mask, something that could be peeled away. Suddenly, the baby's eyes, those dark, empty eyes, narrowed, and Amanda saw a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of something that wasn't quite human. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What are you?" The baby's lips curled into a smile, too wide, too twisted. And as it did, a dark figure emerged from the shadows, its form barely discernible in the shifting darkness. Amanda gasped, her heart stopping in her chest as the figure drew closer, its presence suffocating. "Help me," it whispered again, and Amanda knew, deep down, that it was too late. Amanda struggled, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the cold fingers of the creature, "No," the changeling, tightened around her wrist. The warmth of her skin was slipping away, replaced by an icy grip that sank deep into her bones. Her body screamed for escape, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. But no matter how hard she pulled, no matter how fiercely she fought, the changeling's hold was unyielding. "This isn't real," she thought, desperately trying to convince herself, even as terror flooded her veins. "I'm just dreaming. But the fingers tightening around her wrist didn't feel like a dream. They felt like death. Cold, unrelenting death. She looked back at the crib. The baby, Liam, was no longer in it. The sheets that had once covered him were now twisted and torn, the blanket draped in an unnatural way. The room felt colder, darker, and Amanda could swear she saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision. Shadows that were not there before. "Liam!" she cried, her voice cracking as she yanked her arm with all her might. But the changeling didn't respond. It only stared at her, its eyes cold and empty, hollow like black pits that swallowed the light around them. The smile that never seemed to leave its face, grew wider, stretching impossibly, until it seemed to twist and distort. Her mind raced, her thoughts spinning in circles. She had to get away. She had to protect herself. She had to protect her real son wherever he was. The room seemed to close in around her. The air was suffocating, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on her, closing in with each passing second. The whispers that had haunted her before now surrounded her, filling her ears with promises of something darker. "Help me," the voice whispered again, so close now that Amanda could almost feel its breath on her neck. The changeling's grin spread wider, and Amanda saw something glinting in its hand. A sharp, twisted object, its blade shimmering with a sickly, unnatural glow. Her eyes widened. No. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. "Stop!" she screamed, as the changeling took a step forward, its grin widening with every movement. "Please, what do you want?" The creature didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head, its eyes locked on hers, cold and calculating, as though it was studying her every move. There was no humanity left in those eyes. No compassion, no love, only malice. Without warning, it lunged, and Amanda stumbled back, her heart leaping into her throat. She twisted, trying to break free, but the changeling was too fast, its movements unervingly smooth, its limbs bending at impossible angles. She screamed as it grabbed her once more, dragging her back toward the crib, her body twisting in pain. "No!" she cried out, the tears streaming down her face. "This can't be happening." The changeling was silent, its smile never faltering as it slowly lowered her to the floor. Amanda's mind reeled, her vision flickering between the creature before her and the crib that was now empty. Where was her son? What had they done to him? Desperately, she twisted in its grip, trying to break free, but the changeling's hold was too strong. It was no longer just a child. It was something worse, something that didn't belong in this world. "Liam!" Amanda cried again, her voice hoarse. "Please, what have you done with him?" The changeling's lips curled into that grotesque smile once more, and it tilted its head as if contemplating her question. Then, in a voice that was not its own, it whispered, "He's mine now." Amanda's heart skipped a beat. The voice wasn't the one she had come to recognize as her son's. It wasn't the soft, innocent sound she had held on to since his birth. This was something darker, something old. Terror flooded her chest as the words sank in. "No!" she gasped, shaking her head furiously. "You can't have him. You're not Liam. You're not my son." The changeling tilted its head again, its smile widening even more. "Oh, but I am," it purred, its voice dripping with malice. "I've always been here, watching, waiting." Amanda's blood ran cold as she realized the horrible truth. The changeling wasn't just a twisted reflection of her son. It had been in the house long before she ever set foot in it. It had been waiting for her, watching her every move. It had chosen her family. Tears filled Amanda's eyes as her mind scrambled to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before her. How could this be real? How could a creature like this exist? And what could she do to stop it? The changeling began to laugh, a high, shrill sound that grated against her ears, sending shivers down her spine. "You don't know, do you?" it whispered, its voice suddenly softer, as though it was speaking directly into her ear. "You don't know how long I've waited, how many families I've destroyed, how many lives I've stolen. And now it's your turn." Amanda felt her stomach turn as the words sank in. It wasn't just after her son. It was after her, too. With newfound determination, Amanda pushed herself up from the floor, using every ounce of strength she had left. She wasn't going to let this thing, take her family, not without a fight. As she scrambled to her feet, she noticed something strange, something that made her blood run cold. The room was changing. The walls, once white and sterile, were now darkening, covered in cracks that seemed to spread like veins across the surface. The light flickered and dimmed, casting long shadows that danced along the walls, as though they were alive. And then, in the corner of the room, Amanda saw it. A shadow, a shape, a man. It was the figure she had seen earlier, the one who had whispered to her in the darkness. "Help me." The voice came again, but this time it was clearer, more defined. The man in the corner wasn't just a shadow. He was real. He was flesh and blood. "Who are you?" Amanda demanded, her voice trembling. "What is happening?" The figure took a step forward, his eyes hollow, his expression one of deep sorrow. "You don't understand," he said, his voice filled with regret. "It's already too late." Amanda's heart hammered in her chest as she took a step back, the room seeming to close in around her. The changeling smiled at her, its eyes gleaming with satisfaction. It was all part of the game, but Amanda couldn't give up. "Not now. Please," she whispered, almost pleading. "Please, help me." The man's face twisted with grief as he stepped closer, but his words were cold and final. "It's not your baby anymore. It never was." Amanda's breath caught in her throat as the truth hit her like a wave, and her world began to crumble around her. Amanda's breath quickened, her pulse thundering in her ears as she stumbled backward, her legs weak beneath her. The shadows seemed to close in around her, crawling across the walls like living things, hungry, relentless. The figure, the man in the corner, stepped forward, his face ashen, hollow eyes staring through her. His expression twisted with sorrow, yet his voice was tinged with something darker, something foreboding. "It's not your baby anymore. It never was." His words sliced through Amanda's mind like a blade, and her body froze in terror. She could feel the weight of them, sinking deep into her soul. Liam, her sweet, innocent boy. How could this be happening? How could it be real? "Why?" she whispered, barely able to force the words past her dry lips. "Why are you doing this? What does it want from me? From my son?" The man's lips quivered as if he wanted to speak, but his voice came out choked and strained. "It's not just your son, Amanda. It's the child, the one who has always been here, the one who has always waited." The man took another step toward her, and Amanda could feel the coldness of the room seeping deeper into her bones. The temperature had dropped. The chill in the air wasn't just from the shadows. It was something other, something ancient, something that didn't belong in this world. "I don't understand," Amanda murmured, her chest tightening as she fought to stay conscious, to stay strong. "What do you mean? What is it?" The man's voice faltered, and he reached out a trembling hand, his fingers just inches from her arm. "It's an ancient curse, a force that has existed for centuries, passing from one family to the next. Every time it takes a child, it feeds, it grows stronger. It waits for the perfect moment to strike." Amanda's heart skipped a beat, her stomach churning. It was all too much to process, too much to comprehend. But she could feel it now, deep inside her, the truth of what he was saying. It wasn't just a nightmare, it was real. She took a step back, her mind spinning. "Liam," she gasped, looking at the empty crib, the twisted blanket. "Where is he? What's happening to him?" The man's face twisted in agony, his eyes filled with a mix of pity and regret. "It's gone, Amanda. The changeling, it has already taken him. You've been living with it, nurturing it, But now you must understand. You cannot save him." Amanda's breath hitched as his words sank in. Her mind was numb. Her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as she realized the horrific truth. Her son was gone, but a part of her refused to believe it. She couldn't. She wouldn't. She would fight with everything she had to get him back. She had to. "No," Amanda whispered, shaking her head furiously. "No, I won't believe you. I won't let it take my son. I will fight." The man's expression softened, but it was too late for regret. His eyes, now clouded with a strange kind of despair, met hers. "It's too late, Amanda. It's already begun. The changeling will never let you go. It will always be with you." A sudden noise interrupted their conversation. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. The creak of a floorboard. A whisper of movement. Amanda's head whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. The crib. Something was in the crib. Something moving. "Liam," she breathed, rushing toward it without thinking. She didn't care about the man's warnings. She didn't care that the shadows seemed to reach for her with every step. Her child, her real child, was in that crib, and she was going to find him no matter what it took. She reached the crib, her hands trembling as she pulled back the blanket. But when she looked inside, her heart stopped. The crib was empty. There was no baby, no signs of life, only a note. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as she saw the scribbled message in the corner of the crib. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, as though written in haste, but it was unmistakable. The words were clear. "You can never take him back. He belongs to us now." Tears burned her eyes as she stood there, her hand hovering over the note, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and disbelief. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She turned back to the man, her voice now barely a whisper. What does it mean? Who are they?" The man took a step back, his eyes widening in fear. "The ones who came before you. The ones who have always been here." Amanda's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean? Who are they?" But the man didn't answer. He only turned away from her, his shoulders hunched as if he was trying to escape the very words he had spoken. The shadows in the room seemed to move again, swirling in the corners, creeping toward her with a life of their own. Amanda's legs felt weak beneath her. She couldn't escape it. The darkness was everywhere. The changeling was not the only threat. There were others. As she looked at the walls, now covered in strange symbols she didn't recognize, Amanda felt an overwhelming sense of doom settle over her. The house was alive, and it was hungry. "Help me," the man whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with a deep sense of hopelessness. "Get out while you can." Amanda turned to leave, her every step heavy with dread. The door to the nursery was within reach, just a few more feet, and yet she couldn't help but feel the presence of something behind her, something that was watching, waiting. She pushed the door open, stepping into the dark hallway. But as she did, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash. The house seemed to exhale, a low, guttural sound that rattled the walls. Amanda whipped around, her heart racing. It was too late. The changeling was no longer the only threat. The house had claimed her. It had claimed her family. And now it was going to take everything from her. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as the chant grew louder, reverberating through the house, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating cloak. The words were indecipherable, foreign, as though they were part of some long-forgotten language, one that should never be spoken again. But they were unmistakable in their intent. A summons, call for her to stay. She stood frozen in the hallway, her breath shallow, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. But the walls around her seemed to close in, as if the house itself had decided she wasn't allowed to leave. The whispers were everywhere now, coming from the very corners of the room, the cracks in the walls, the floors beneath her feet. The cold that had taken over the house seemed to intensify, seeping into her bones, numbing her body. The flickering light from the hallway lamp cast long, grotesque shadows that stretched and shifted like twisted figures, moving on their own accord. It wasn't just the changeling. The house was alive. Amanda stumbled backward, her eyes darting to the nursery door that she had just come from. The crib was still empty. The note was still there, but she couldn't go back to that room. Not now. Not when she knew that whatever was in that crib wasn't her son. But where was Liam? She had to find him. She had to save him. She took a few steps toward the staircase at the end of the hallway, but before she could move any farther, the door to the nursery burst open behind her with a sudden, violent force. Amanda whipped around, her pulse quickening. The room was dark, the shadows thickening at the edges of the doorway. The air smelled of something foul, decay, rot, and then she saw it. A figure, dark, tall, and shrouded in shadow, stood just inside the doorway, blocking the light. Its form seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally, like something that was not meant to exist in this world. The air around it crackled, a charge of energy that sent a shiver down Amanda's spine. "Liam," she whispered, her voice cracking with a mixture of fear and desperation. But the figure didn't answer. It only stood there, its presence heavy and oppressive. Slowly, it began to move, stepping forward with an unnatural grace. As it did, the shadows seemed to follow, wrapping around its limbs like tendrils of darkness, pulling the very light from the room. Amanda's legs shook beneath her, but she forced herself to take a step forward, her hands trembling at her sides. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Where is my son?" The figure didn't speak. Instead, it reached out, a single elongated hand emerging from the shadows, its fingers long and slender, ending in claws that seemed to gleam with malice. Amanda's heart leaped into her throat, and she took a step back, fear tightening her chest. She needed to run. She needed to get out of there, but her legs refused to move. Just then, the figure stopped. It hovered at the threshold, its body shifting as though it were deciding whether or not to step into the hallway. Amanda could feel its gaze on her, even though it had no eyes. It was watching her, waiting for her to make a choice. And then, without warning, it whispered, "Liam is mine now." The words sent a jolt of cold terror through Amanda's spine. She didn't understand. How? Why? Her mind reeled as she tried to make sense of it. But the figure spoke again, its voice like the scraping of metal against stone. "His soul is bound to me, and now so is yours." Amanda's blood ran cold. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed against the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had to leave. She had to escape before whatever this thing was took her, too. But as she turned to run, she heard something. A sound, a cry, came from upstairs. Liam. She knew that voice. It was unmistakable. Without thinking, Amanda pushed herself off the wall, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled toward the staircase. Every step felt like an eternity, each one heavier than the last, as if the house itself were trying to pull her back into its dark embrace. As she reached the top of the stairs, she could hear the cry more clearly now. It wasn't the cry of an infant. It was different, higher pitched, more desperate, more unnatural. Amanda's blood ran cold as she reached the door to Liam's room. She hesitated for only a moment before slamming it open, her hands shaking. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon outside. But it wasn't the room that made her freeze. It was the crib. It was empty again, But this time, something else was there. A shadow. A long, twisted shape that stretched out across the floor like a snake, winding its way toward the corner of the room. Amanda's breath caught in her throat as she stepped forward, her eyes drawn to the dark form. And then she saw him, Liam, her baby, but he wasn't lying in the crib anymore. He was standing in the corner of the room, facing the wall, his back to her. "Liam?" Amanda whispered, her voice barely audible as she took a trembling step closer. The baby didn't respond. He didn't even move. "Liam?" she repeated, her voice rising with panic. "Please, baby, come to me." But as she took another step forward, the baby slowly turned around, his face obscured by shadows. And when the light from the hallway touched his face, Amanda gasped in horror. It wasn't Liam. The face that stared back at her was cold, expressionless, and devoid of warmth. It was a face she didn't recognize. A face twisted, contorted, like something that had been molded from nightmares. And then it spoke, in Liam's voice. "Mama, you can't save me." Amanda staggered backward, her hands flying to her mouth in disbelief. The world spun around her, and she could hear the whispering growing louder, closer, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on her. She turned and fled from the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she ran down the hall, her mind reeling with terror. But as she reached the stairs, the house seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the floorboards groaning beneath her feet. The front door. She had to reach the front door, but when she tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. Something was blocking it, something powerful. The whispers, the chanting grew louder. The house was alive. It was no longer just a building, it was a living, breathing entity. And it wasn't going to let her go. Cliffhanger. The lights flickered, and in the dark, something stepped into the hallway, casting a shadow that stretched toward her like a hand, ready to claim her. Amanda's heart raced, her breath shallow, as she backed into the corner of the hallway, her eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. The door was locked. She couldn't leave. The house seemed to mock her attempt to escape, its walls closing in with every passing moment. The chanting was still in her ears, the eerie murmurs becoming louder and more persistent, as if they were coming from the very bones of the house itself. She looked down at the floor, her hand gripping the banister so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. The figure in the nursery had spoken, its voice seeping into her mind like poison. "Liam is mine now," the words echoed, and each repetition of them made her skin crawl. But Amanda wasn't going to give up. She couldn't. Not when her son was still out there, somewhere in this cursed house. Not when she knew that whatever had taken him was still lurking in the dark, waiting for the right moment to claim her, too. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating, heavy, and suffused with a sense of dread that Amanda couldn't shake. She clenched her jaw, gathering every ounce of courage she had. She had to find Liam, even if it meant facing whatever waited for her in the dark corners of the house. With hesitant steps, she moved down the narrow hallway, her eyes scanning every shadow. As she passed the door to the living room, she thought she heard something soft, like the rustle of clothing or a low breath. Amanda froze, her pulse quickening. She could feel it again, that sense that she was being watched, stalked. Turning slowly, her eyes met the reflection in the darkened window. It was her own face staring back at her, pale and filled with terror. But it wasn't just her face. The reflection seemed to distort, to warp, as if someone else was standing beside her. Someone she couldn't see with her eyes but could feel, pressing in from the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. She whirled around, but there was no one there. The house was playing tricks on her. It had to be. Panic surged in her chest, and she ran toward the kitchen, her feet slapping against the hardwood floor. She reached for the door, but the knob twisted on its own. Slowly, the door creaked open, revealing an empty room, until her eyes landed on the kitchen table. There, sitting in the middle of the table, was a small wooden box. Amanda froze. It was the same box she had seen earlier in the nursery, the one that had held the old photographs. But this time, the box was open, and inside, something was different. The familiar, comforting photographs were gone. Instead, there was a small, folded note with a single word scrawled on the front. Liam. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the note, unfolding it carefully. The words were written in a script she didn't recognize, jagged and hurried, as though the writer had been pressed for time. It read, "Do not trust the child." The words burned into her mind. She didn't understand. Who had written this? What was happening to her family? Suddenly, a sound broke through her thoughts. A soft, cooing noise, like a baby's cry. It was coming from upstairs. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. Her legs moved before she could think, and she bolted toward the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, and the hairs on her arms stood on end. Every footstep seemed to echo louder in the empty house, the silence pressing in on her. When she reached the top of the stairs, she could hear it more clearly now. The baby's cry. It was distant, but it wasn't the normal, gentle wail of an infant. This sound was strained, agonized, as though the child were trapped in some kind of pain. Amanda's mind raced. Where was the baby? Where was Liam? She hurried down the hall toward his room, her heart pounding in her chest. As she approached, she could hear something else. Soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she placed it on the knob. It was warm to the touch, as though someone had just been inside. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The nursery was dark, the moonlight spilling through the windows, casting long, ominous shadows across the room. The crib was empty just like before, but the room felt wrong, heavier somehow. And then she saw it. A small figure stood in the corner of the room, its back to her. It was crouched down, its head hung low. For a moment, Amanda thought it was her son, but then she saw the shadows shift, and she knew. It wasn't Liam. This wasn't her baby. The figure slowly turned around, and Amanda felt her blood run cold. The face that looked back at her was pale, almost sickly. Its eyes were wide, too wide, and they glowed with an unnatural light. The lips curled into a twisted grin, but it wasn't a smile. It was a sneer, as if mocking her. And then it spoke. "Do you really think you can save him?" The voice was familiar, but distorted, like it had been twisted by some dark force. It was a voice she had heard only a few times before, the voice of the child she thought was her son. But it wasn't him. Couldn't be. Amanda took a step back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Liam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the creature just laughed, its laugh high-pitched and shrill, filling the room with a bone-chilling echo. Amanda turned and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. But as she reached the door, she felt something icy grip her wrist. She screamed, pulling her arm free, but the cold lingered, spreading up her arm like poison. When she turned to face it again, the room was empty. The figure was gone, but the whispers were back, louder now, more insistent. They were coming from all directions, surrounding her, pressing in. "Do not trust the child," the whisper said, over and over again. Amanda's legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The weight of the house seemed to press down on her, suffocating her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. For a moment, there was nothing. No whispers, No cries, no shadows. Just the overwhelming silence that filled the house. But Amanda knew, deep down, that it wouldn't last. Whatever had replaced her son was still here, and it wasn't going to let her leave. She pushed herself up from the floor, her body shaking. She had to find Liam. She had to end this. But where would she even begin? Cliffhanger. The door to the nursery slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house like a final warning. Amanda looked around, her eyes wide with fear. The house had won its first battle, but she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Amanda's breath was ragged as she stumbled back from the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the banister. The house felt alive, shifting around her as if it had a pulse, a heartbeat that throbbed in time with her own. The air was thick, too thick, like the walls themselves were closing in. And then the whispers began again, low and insistent, rising from the shadows that seemed to be alive. Her heart hammered in her chest, a painful rhythm that made her head spin. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but where could she go? The house had become a labyrinth, a twisted maze that stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no way out. The words came again, clearer now, echoing from the corners of the room. Do not trust the child. Amanda's skin prickled with cold as her fingers brushed against the wall. The very air felt wrong, wrong in a way she couldn't explain, as if the house itself was taunting her. It had changed her son. It had taken Liam from her, replaced him with something else. The thing in the nursery, the creature that had called itself her son, was still in her mind. She could see its twisted grin, its glowing eyes, hear the sinister laughter that had sent chills through her spine. The thing had spoken with Liam's voice, but it was not Liam. And the worst part? She had no idea where the real Liam was, or what had happened to him. Amanda's mind raced as she tried to think, to remember what she had seen. The box, the photographs, the cryptic message written in strange handwriting. It had all led her here. But why? A voice in her head screamed for her to leave, to grab Liam and run, to get out of this nightmare before it consumed them both. But she couldn't leave without answers. She couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, win. It had already taken so much from her. As she turned, her eyes caught sight of the hallway leading to the stairs. The faint flicker of candlelight flickered in the distance, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The stairs seemed to beckon, as though something was waiting for her up there. Her instincts screamed at her to ignore it, to turn and run in the other direction, but something deep inside urged her to climb. There was no way out unless she faced this. Amanda's legs shook as she ascended the stairs, her every step echoing in the silence. The house was unnervingly quiet now, as though holding its breath, watching her. The cold air seemed to wrap around her like a vice, making her shiver, but she forced herself forward, driven by the need to find her son. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated, listening. The house was holding its breath, waiting. The only sound was the faint whisper of wind outside, and the pulse of her own heartbeat in her ears. And then she heard it. A soft thud, a scraping sound, came from the nursery. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. She had to go back in. She had to face whatever was in there, whatever had taken her child and replaced him with a monster. Her fingers gripped the cold doorknob once more, her knuckles white as she twisted it. The door creaked open, and she was met with the same suffocating darkness. The shadows seemed to stretch farther this time, more oppressive, as if the room had grown larger, more cavernous. The soft flicker of the candlelight from earlier danced on the walls, casting grotesque shapes in the corners of the room. But there was no sign of Liam, no sign of the thing that had taken his place. Amanda's heart sank as she stepped inside. The room was empty, save for the crib, now eerily still, and the rocking chair in the corner. It hadn't been like this before. There had been movement, a presence, something that had been waiting for her. But now, nothing. Just the suffocating silence. Then, from the corner of the room, she saw it. The faint glow. The rocking chair was moving, slowly, its creaking filling the room with an unsettling rhythm. As she watched, the glow intensified, until the entire chair was bathed in a sickly, greenish light. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. The chair moved again, faster this time, and the shadows seemed to shift with it, as if they were being dragged along by an unseen hand. And then, from the darkness, it spoke. "You left me," the voice said, a rasping whisper, so familiar and so wrong at once. It was Liam's voice, but twisted, broken. Amanda's legs wobbled, and she staggered back. Her mind screamed at her to run, to get out of the room, but she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure that was slowly emerging from the shadows. It was Liam, but it wasn't. The creature that stepped out of the darkness wore his face, but it was wrong. Its eyes were too wide, too empty, and its skin was pale, stretched tight across its bones. It grinned at her with sharp, jagged teeth, its smile widening impossibly, as though it could swallow her whole. "You abandoned me," the creature said again, its voice low and guttural. "No," Amanda whispered, backing away, her heart hammering in her chest. "No, you're not him. You're not Liam." The thing laughed, a sound that made her skin crawl. It was a high-pitched, hollow laugh, devoid of warmth, as though it were mocking her, taunting her. "You can't save him," it hissed. "He's mine now." Amanda's mind raced. What was it? What had happened to her son? The creature took a step toward her, its twisted smile never faltering. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls shifting and warping, as if the house itself was alive. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, pressing in on her, suffocating her. She turned and ran, her feet stumbling as she dashed for the door. She had to get out. She had to find Liam. But the door slammed shut in front of her, as though the house itself was keeping her trapped inside. Panic surged within her. She banged on the door, her fists pounding against the wood, but it wouldn't budge. The creature's laughter echoed in the room, growing louder, more menacing. "Leave him alone," Amanda screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. But the creature only smiled wider. Amanda's pulse raced in her ears as she struggled to comprehend what she had just heard. The voice, it wasn't just in her head. It was real, coming from somewhere deep within the house, as if the walls themselves were whispering to her, mocking her efforts. The world around her seemed to bend and warp, the shadows reaching out with a life of their own. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though it was choking the very breath from her lungs. Her hands trembled as she slammed her palms against the door, the wood cold and unforgiving beneath her fingertips. "No, please, let me out," she cried out, her voice ragged with panic. She banged her fists against the door again, louder this time, desperate, but the heavy silence that followed made her blood run cold. The creature's laugh echoed around her like a twisted symphony, reverberating off the walls. It wasn't Liam, couldn't be. The thing that had taken his place was something else entirely, something that had no place in this world. And yet, it stood there, grinning at her with that smile that made her insides churn. "You can't escape," the creature purred, its voice unnervingly sweet. "There's nowhere to run. You're trapped." Amanda's chest tightened as she turned to face the room. She felt the walls closing in around her, the air growing thicker with each passing second. The shadows seemed to grow longer, stretching out like fingers, creeping toward her. And then, for the first time, She saw it. The thing's eyes, glowing in the darkness, watching her with an intensity that sent a shiver up her spine. Her breath hitched in her throat. The creature had been speaking in her son's voice, but this was different. The smile on its face was wrong. Its eyes far too wide, too empty. It was not her child. It was an imitation. Something that had taken Liam from her and replaced him with something twisted and grotesque. Her hands shook as she pressed her palms against the cold, unforgiving wood of the door, willing it to open, to give her some escape, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her veins, cold and unrelenting. The shadows seemed to reach out, pulling her closer to the creature. "Liam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Where's my son? What have you done to him?" The thing tilted its head, the smile never fading. "Your son is gone," it said, its voice full of venom. "He's been replaced. He's mine now." Amanda stumbled back, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words were trapped in her throat. How could this be happening? Where was Liam? Why wasn't he in the crib? She couldn't remember the last time she had seen him. Had he ever truly been there? Or was he just another figment of her imagination? A fleeting dream that had slipped through her fingers? "No," she whispered again, more firmly this time. "No, you're lying. You're not him." The creature's grin widened, its teeth gleaming in the dim light. "I am your son," it said, the words chilling her to the bone. "I'm the one who cries at night, the one you cradle in your arms, the one you love." Her heart twisted painfully in her chest. It was wrong. Everything was wrong. She had to get out of there. But where could she go? The house was a prison, its walls closing in around her, trapping her inside. She was running out of time. The walls began to hum, a low, vibrating sound that made her teeth ache. The floor beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the house was alive and shifting, its foundation groaning under the weight of its secrets. The air was thick with a stifling presence, as though something was watching her, something waiting. "I won't let you take him," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. She turned away from the door, taking a shaky step toward the crib, her eyes never leaving the creature. "Where is Liam? Where is my son?" The creature's eyes gleamed with malice as it took a step closer. "You'll never find him," it hissed. "He's gone, Amanda. Gone forever." A surge of dread shot through her, paralyzing her in place. The air seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping until she could see her breath misting in the cold room. The shadows seemed to deepen, pressing in on her, and the rocking chair creaked in the corner, as though urging her to look. Amanda's heart skipped a beat as she glanced toward the corner. The chair was still rocking, but now it wasn't alone. Something or someone was standing in the shadowed doorway. Figure. It was too dark to make out any features, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Person, or something that had once been a person. Amanda froze, her throat tightening as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure was tall, its form looming in the darkness like a specter. She could feel its eyes on her, piercing through the blackness, drawing her in with an invisible force. Her feet felt like lead as she slowly stepped forward, her eyes locked on the figure. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the figure in the doorway, the one that seemed to be waiting for her to make a move. And then the figure stepped forward. The world around her seemed to freeze. The creature, the thing that had replaced Liam, laughed softly, the sound almost too sweet to be real. It was a laugh that chilled her blood, a sound that made her skin crawl. "You can't save him," it whispered, its voice low and mocking. "You're too late." Amanda's breath hitched in her throat as the figure in the doorway stepped closer, and the air grew thick with an unnatural coldness. The shadows shifted again, stretching toward her, as if the house itself was closing in, trapping her inside. But then the figure spoke. "Mom." It was a voice that Amanda knew, a voice that, for a split second, sounded like Liam's. The voice that had once called to her in the darkness of the night. Her heart skipped a beat, her body trembling as she tried to process what she was hearing. Was it him? Was it truly her son? Or was it just another trick? Another part of the nightmare she had found herself trapped in? "Liam," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She stepped forward, her legs unsteady beneath her. The figure's smile widened, stretching impossibly wide, until it looked like its face might tear in half. "Liam's gone," it hissed. "You'll never see him again." Amanda screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence that had consumed the room. The shadows seemed to close in on her, and the air became oppressive, stifling, until it felt as if she couldn't breathe. Amanda gasped, her lungs burning as she sucked in air, her eyes snapping open. The room was still dark, but the oppressive weight had lifted. She sat up, blinking rapidly, her mind struggling to catch up with the frantic beat of her heart. Was it over? Was it just another nightmare? But no. The cold, empty room, the rocking chair still swaying in the corner, was a stark reminder that she was trapped in this hellish reality. Her head spun as the whispers from the darkness clawed at her thoughts. Liam, her son, was still gone, replaced by something else. A flicker of movement caught her eye. The crib. Her heart nearly stopped. There, lying innocently in the crib, was the child, the thing that looked like her son. It lay motionless, its small chest rising and falling with every shallow breath, its hands curled into tiny fists. Amanda swallowed, struggling to fight the growing unease. Her feet felt heavy as she moved toward the crib, each step slow, deliberate. The room felt colder, darker, the shadows stretching longer as if something was waiting. The silence was deafening, pressing in on her from all sides. She reached the crib, her eyes never leaving the small figure inside. It was Liam, wasn't it? No, something was wrong. The weight in her chest, the gnawing dread, told her otherwise. Her hand trembled as she reached for the child, lifting it carefully from the crib. Felt too light, like holding a doll. She cradled the small body to her chest, staring down at its sleeping face. The features were too still, too perfect, too empty. And then she saw it, the telltale sign, a small, dark mark on the child's neck, exactly like the one she had noticed a few days before, when the thing had first arrived. A mark that had never been there before. Her breath caught in her throat as she suddenly realized the creature had left its mark. This was it, the final proof. It wasn't her son. The blood drained from her face as a sickening realization washed over her. The thing she had been trying to convince herself was Liam wasn't Liam at all. This thing was not her child. It was something far darker, far more sinister. The room seemed to darken again, as if the shadows were reacting to her thoughts, growing ever more oppressive. The temperature dropped, the walls groaned, and in the eerie silence, Amanda could hear something else. A voice. Her name. It was faint at first, a whisper, as though it was far away. But then it grew louder, closer, more insistent. "Amanda!" The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she turned quickly, her heart racing. Standing in the doorway was the figure, the tall, dark shape she had seen before, the one that had haunted her dreams and her waking moments. This time, it wasn't just a silhouette. The figure stepped forward, revealing its face, or what was left of it. It was a grotesque mask, stretched and warped, its features twisted in a permanent snarl. Its eyes were hollow, dark pits, but when it spoke, Its voice was unmistakable. "You can't save him, Amanda," it rasped. "You never could." Amanda's breath caught in her throat. What are you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, her body frozen in place. The creature tilted its head, a grotesque, mocking smile spreading across its face. "I'm the one who's been watching you, the one who's been waiting, the one who took your child." She couldn't tear her eyes away from the creature, her mind racing. No, this isn't happening." She clutched the child tighter to her chest, desperate to protect it, desperate to protect herself. The figure laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed in the room like nails on a chalkboard. "It's too late for that, Amanda. The child is mine now, and so are you." The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, as if responding to its words, a suffocating presence growing stronger, surrounding her. She could feel the walls closing in, suffocating her, pressing down on her. It wasn't just the child that was gone. It was her life, her very essence, that had been stolen. "Let me go!" Amanda screamed, her voice breaking as she backed away from the creature. "Please, let me go!" The creature's eyes gleamed with dark amusement. "You've been chosen, Amanda. This house, this place, it feeds on you, feeds on your fear." Amanda's heart pounded painfully in her chest as she stumbled back, clutching the child to her. But the thing's voice echoed through her mind, relentless. "You will never escape," it whispered, the words curling in her ears like poison. "You will never leave this place." Suddenly, Amanda froze. Her blood ran cold, her heart thudding in her chest. Something wasn't right. The child in her arms, it was moving. Her mind screamed at her, but her body refused to obey. She looked down at the thing that resembled Liam, but this time, there was no warmth, no life in its eyes. It was empty. The child's face shifted, its features warping into a grotesque mask of horror. The eyes grew wide, impossibly wide, and the mouth twisted into a cruel grin. It reached up, its fingers curling around her wrist with inhuman strength. And then, in a voice that was not her son's, it whispered in her ear, "You're mine now." The world around Amanda went dark. The shadows swallowed her whole, and in that moment, she realized the terrible truth. There was no escaping. The changeling had won.